very happy to have for this issue of Noisy Reality, Zaid Ali. Did I get that right?
Zaid Al Ali,
Zaid
almost.
Ali. And he's a visiting scholar at Princeton University. He's the author of Arab Constitutionalism. And can you just give a background of explain to the audience what the IDA is and what kind of work you've done for the United Nations?
Yeah, so it's the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. It's an intergovernmental organization that has its headquarters in Stockholm, has 36 member states, and it's the only intergovernmental organization in the world that has as its mandate to promote democracy as a system of government. Like others can't do it because they have very large numbers of member states that can't, including countries that aren't democratic. So they can't promote democracy, but our organization does, and it's governmental. It's not non-governmental. And in that capacity, what I do is I work with them to provide advice to constitutional negotiators, constitutional drafters, as they try to put together democratic constitutions. And then with the UN, I used to work full time for the UN in the past. Currently, what I do is I either work in collaboration or in consultation with the UN in a variety of contexts, including in Libya, Yemen, and other places as well, to provide assistance for the same type of purpose. Because most of the efforts where we work aren't where IDEA works, there aren't contexts where only IDEA works. There's always a combination of international actors, including the UN. So whenever the UN's around, you'll want to collaborate and cooperate with them. And I do that in different respects and different capacities, depending on the context.
Now, today, of course, we're going to focus in on Syria, but I wanted to sort of introduce our audience in general to the sort of ideas you talk about in your book, Arab Constitutionalism. Now, first of all, you have a pretty broad sweep. You're dealing with, and I'm just looking at the list here, Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Libya, Jordan, Morocco, Sudan, Algeria, all countries with very different histories on the in the issue of how they're controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And I'm wondering if you could first talk about that, the Ottoman Empire, and what kind of, quote, constitutions, end quote, what kind of forms of government do we see imposed by that rule, and how that relates to the colonial period?
Yeah, sure. So the Ottoman Empire at some point controlled all the countries in the Middle East and North Africa. So all Arab countries, apart from Morocco. Morocco is the only country that never came under Ottoman rule. And as a result of that, the empire was very influential in the way in which those countries were governed, and also what remained from that influence after they lost control and were subsumed within the British and French empires as well. So the Ottoman period basically lasted, for most of these countries, lasted up until around about the First World War. The Ottomans fought on the wrong side of that war, siding with Germany and in Italy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And as a result of that fact, they lost control over all of their the countries that they were governing, including countries like Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and other places as well. And by virtue of that, then they lost all those territories to colonial countries, meaning to the United Kingdom and to France. So that France was already in control over a number of territories, including Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And the United Kingdom was already in control over Egypt and Sudan. And Libya, being the only exception to all of this, was already under the control of the Italians, who were extremely brutal in their control and their war against Libya. But basically, by and large, what's happening is that you have this system that existed throughout the region that was an Ottoman system, not very democratic, gradually progressing towards a more modern form of rule, combined with a growing sense of nationalism that was sweeping across Europe and the Ottoman Empire. And in the Ottoman Empire, it was in favor of Turkish nationalism as opposed to Ottoman nationalism, given that there was no Ottoman identity. It was a combination of ethno-sectarian groups, right? And so within the Ottoman Empire, Turkish nationalism was on the rise, which then fed into or had as a counter-reaction Arab nationalism as well in countries like Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and other places as well. And then that basically segued into, as a result of the First World War, into the colonial period, where the British and the French had a huge amount of influence over these countries' system of government, much more, I would say, than the Ottomans did, given that the Ottomans preceded the French and British periods.
Now, one of the characteristics you talk about in terms of colonialism is, for example, the elite alliances, which we can sort of see with France and Britain, Belgium, and Africa, and in their the sweep of imperialism in the 19th century, but certainly in the Middle East. For example, the Hashemite dynasty established as a result of the First World War, or alliances made with Moroccan elites, etc. And then of course, you talk about the question of the extractive economy, the issue of these are colonial relationships with the political economy, and also the use of violence. But just explain a little bit about that constitutional legacy of colonialism in the Middle East, and of course, the variety of it.
Yeah. So basically, this is something that's common to both the Ottoman Empire and also to the British and French manner of governing. Is that, I mean, obviously, none of these things were democratic. And there was no intention to be democratic. It was never going to be, let's just vote in favor of a political party or a president, and then that person will rule in a democratic, according to a democratic system. The system as provided for by the Ottomans and by the French and the British was basically to create a series of alliances with elite groups. And the elite groups were varied. They consisted of, for example, the bureaucracy, which was its own group, sometimes security services, right? So if there was a military that existed in these countries, then that would be part of the elite groups as well. The business community, the legal community, judges, the religious community in some cases. So all of these groups would form concentrated circles, and they would be governed together as a group by either the Ottomans or by the British and French, and afterwards, and we'll get into this later, after the colonial period ended, by whoever it is that took over from the colonial powers, the United Kingdom and France. And so that system could more or less function depending on a system of factors. So one factor was that the forces at the center that were keeping the peace between these different elite groups had to be strong enough, had to have a sufficient capacity to exercise violence and physical control over the country and these elite groups to scare them into position, to make sure that they would all follow the rules that were imposed upon them by these foreigners, right? So by the Ottoman Empire or the British or the French and the Italians in Libya. So that's one thing. And that obviously waned seriously after the end of the Second World War, where the British and the French couldn't keep control. They didn't have sufficient forces or military might to keep control anymore, right? So that's one characteristic that was very important that allowed them for that to continue for so long. And another was that the proportions of people who were outside of the elite groups, meaning marginalized segments of society, had to be small enough in number so that they couldn't carry out revolts against the elite groups or the foreign occupiers or the foreign dominant forces. So long as they were just 5%, 10%, 20% of the population, then that was broadly okay. We don't exactly know the proportions because those statistics don't really exist, but basically, by and large, by including sufficient numbers of elite groups, and you had enough people in the system so that the rest could be brought under control. But with time, as demographic changes kept increasing and the numbers of marginalized people kept growing and growing and growing, you went from a situation where 10%, 20%, 30% weren't part of the system of government to a situation where it was 90%, right? Sometimes even more. And that became completely unsustainable and uncontrollable for the foreign dominant powers, but also subsequently for the national governments that took over after them, who were relying on the same system of government. And then, of course, so you mentioned the extractive economy. So that's very obvious and it's pretty well known that the British and the French, when they were around, and the Ottomans before them, one of the interests that they had in controlling these territories was to extract resources for their own benefit. So to the extent possible, if there was oil and gas, which was discovered around about the time where the First World War was taking place or ending in places like Iraq and other places, then extract those resources in favor of the British. If it was farming in places like Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, then reserve the best parts of the country, the best land for French farmers, European farmers, and then export those agricultural goods to Europe or sell them at a very high price for that purpose. So, I mean, that was ongoing for a period of decades. Eventually, what ended up happening is that those foreigners were then replaced by locals who maintained the same system. So they weren't extracting those resources in favor of foreign rulers anymore. They're extracting them in favor of themselves, which they could sort of mask for a little while, but eventually became so grotesque that people weren't willing to accept it anymore.
Now, in your book, you talk about, again, we're now in the post-colonial period. So you're talking about, and I'd never heard of this concept before, of hyper-presidentialism, the centralization of power, essentially, and when you read these summaries of these different constitutional debates, the executive essentially trumps everything, more the monarch. And of course, the monopoly of force, usually you got the military involved, the post-colonial military, certainly in Egypt and other countries. But this is all leading, and it's interesting you don't use the term Arab Spring as what happened, with these revolts starting in Tunisia, then spreading out throughout the Arab world. But just to characterize that, and then of course getting up to the Arab Spring, or whatever term you have for it. How do you see that now impacting? Because of course, people were sort of mind blown by what we saw in Egypt, what we saw in Tunisia, et cetera. But just give your take on it.
Yeah. So the reason why we use the term hyper-presidential to refer to these systems of government is because when you look at most of the constitutional texts that govern the Arab region, they look democratic on their face, right? They refer to multi-party democracy, they refer to elections, there's the separation of powers, checks and balances, all the things that you would use to characterize like a liberal democracy like the United States or France or whatever. They're all those same terms are used in Tunisia's constitution of 1959, Egypt's constitution of 1970. All these constitutions say the same thing, like Morocco's constitution. They all refer to the same things, but they're very different, even if they use the same terms and the terms look recognizable and the concepts look recognizable. They're totally different systems of government to what you would have in the States or France or Germany or whatever. And the reason why I say that is because when you put the different elements of the system together, what you realize is that the chief executive, which in some cases is a president and in some cases is a king, when you put all these pieces together, what you see is that the chief of state has power and authority and control over all other branches of government. And just to give two examples, is that in all of these countries, the chief executive is the chief of the courts, is the head of the court system. Now, the court system is supposed to exercise judicial review over the executive. But in these cases, what it says is that the king or the president is the head of the court system. And then another element is that in all of these countries, the president or the king can dissolve parliament, can say parliament can't function anymore, and we're going to cut its term short and organize a new election right away. Okay. And what that means is that just by those two specific arrangements is that the chief of state, meaning the president or the king, controls the courts and controls parliament, right? And that's not a balanced system. It's not a standard presidential system. It's a hyper-presidential system, right? So, and that's one of the things that we've been struggling against in this region, is that that's a legacy from the colonial period. What used to exist under the colonial period is you would have a French guy or British guy that would exercise that control over the system of government. Then when that system ended, when the French and the British were forced out, you had locals that moved in and assumed power, but they assumed power in the exact same way. So it was no longer this French guy or British guy. Now it became a local. It was an Iraqi or an Egyptian or a Tunisian. But the system of government didn't change. It was still the same system, meaning a hyper-presidential system whereby this one person could exercise huge amounts of control over the system and masked within democratic language, making it look like it's democratic, whereas in fact it's not. And to this day, we're still trying to struggle against that and trying to overcome those legacies. And in most cases, we haven't been able to. And it looks like now in Syria, and we'll get into this later, we're heading in that direction as well. Now, in relation to the Arab Spring and And what you said, what you described as being mind blowing, of course, it was mind blowing. It was just an incredible event. There's no question. It was an event of historic proportions, and it was just something that people like me had never really seen before. I don't use the term Arab Spring because I don't really know what that term means, and it sort of assumes to me that everyone was asleep and that suddenly people just woke up, which is not at all what happened. There was a long period of protest and trade union activities or labor union activities, you would say in the States, where people were protesting over a long period of time and trying to attract attention to their plight over a long period. But what people refer to as being the Arab Spring was much greater in terms of numbers of people who were protesting, and also it happened across the region all at the same time. And the other reason why I don't like the term is because people in the region themselves don't like that term either. They don't use the term. So in Tunisia, for example, they don't refer to the uprising as the Arab Spring. They call it the revolution for dignity. And so they don't use the term. Why should I? And the way I characterize it today, after having lived through it over a long period of time and analyzed it and tried to participate in it, is that I would characterize it today as being a pre-revolutionary movement. The region at that point, what was at a point in time where people understood that things needed to change, but they hadn't identified the objective. Like they were in agreement about what needed to change, but they weren't in agreement as to how it needed to change and what needed to replace the previous system. So what ended up happening, instead of a revolution, is that we reverted exactly back to where we were before. There was a period of upheaval, and some people tried to enact change, but ultimately they were unsuccessful. And now today, 2025, we're back almost exactly where we were back in 2010, where this movement started. So it ended up being a pre-revolutionary movement. And hopefully the next time, because there definitely will be next time, although we don't know when it will be, next time people will be more ready and will have a clearer objective as to what type of system of government they want to set in place.
Well, and that's one part of your book that's really interesting, because the whole constitutional process to involve a population, is it the elites, is it the people, who decides, who has a say in this process? And you have a paragraph which I found very interesting, that this is an opportunity to introduce major reforms in a society. And you sort of just ended your comment on a sort of disparaging note that this has not really happened, but just provide some examples, because we saw what happened in Egypt, where and then you have the question of political Islam, which of course is another ingredient in all this. But just give a sense before we turn to Syria about that. And also there's an issue that you raise about individual freedoms, socioeconomic equality, the legitimacy of establishing a constitution. I mean, Lord knows we're seeing in this country, the constitution of this country being, from some of our perspectives, being thrown down the toilet bowl. But the legitimacy issue is interesting. So I'm just curious your comments on these issues.
Yeah. So basically, some examples, some practical examples of what it is I'm talking about, is that we had in Egypt, prior to the uprising, the country was governed by a president who was exercising powers through a hyper-presidential system. And individuals had an almost total absence of rights. On paper, the previous constitution provided for generous rights, but there was so much legislation that ate away at the practice. People had almost no rights. So this, as a very practical example, is that the president, so this is Hosni Mubarak, before the uprising, would disappear for long periods of time. He wouldn't be around sometimes for months, not hours or days or weeks, for months. And the reason why is because he was seeking medical treatment abroad, typically in Germany. And it had, through legislation, the state criminalized speculation about the president's whereabouts and his medical condition. So you couldn't discuss, either in writing or on broadcast or through any means, the absence of the president and its potential consequences, and whether or not he would survive and what should happen if he didn't survive medical treatment, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't allowed at all. So what's left of freedom of speech if you can't discuss the situation of your absent head of state? I mean, it's pretty crazy when you think about it. And they took it to such extreme levels. So that was one of the things, one of the situations that people were extremely upset about, and that they tried to change through the uprising and through efforts to draft a new constitution. But sadly, today, now in Egypt, we're exactly back where we were before. You can't speculate about the president, about his situation. You can't talk about his personal wealth. None of those things are permitted or allowed. You can't speculate or discuss or investigate corruption in the military or in the bureaucracy or in the courts. None of that is allowed. So basically, freedom of speech, the most basic of rights, is exactly where it was before. Some people would say it's even worse than it was before. So that's just one example. But on socioeconomic rights, which is just as important and perhaps even more important for the uprising, because the uprising really was an uprising of lower middle class, working class people in places like Tunisia, Yemen, and other places. And it really started, if you remember, in Tunisia through the suicide of this fruit and vegetable seller, because his fruits and vegetables were confiscated by someone, and he didn't have the means to feed himself and his family, and so therefore set himself alight after having doused himself with kerosene. So for people like that, freedom of speech is nice, but that's really a luxury. What they were really after was socioeconomic rights, like the right to work, for government regulation to be reformed so that they wouldn't interfere in people's livelihoods, for there to be anti-corruption drives so that local officials wouldn't confiscate people's wares and prevent them from selling and making a living. They wanted greater access to education and greater access to healthcare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? And even on those most basic demands, very little change took place. And even if you look at the place where it all started, which is Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia, where that fruit and vegetable seller set himself alight, the only difference between today and 15 years ago is that now there's a municipal sports, like there's a pool and there's a gym that's run by the municipality, right? But otherwise, everything else remains more or less the same. And even socioeconomic conditions, meaning inequality and poverty, is even worse today than it was before, which is one of the reasons why I remain convinced, and I'm not the only one, that that was just round one, and we'll have another round of uprisings at some stage, but we just don't know what needs to happen for it to kick off.
Well, let's turn to Syria then.
Yeah.
So just proceed with what you wanted to do.
Okay. So on Syria, it falls within a category of countries where the uprising led to violent conflict, like extremely violent conflict. So we've had different types of reaction to the uprisings that took place in 2011. Morocco and Jordan quickly tried to control the uprisings without violently repressing them, and try to placate the crowds by amending their constitutions and theoretically making them more democratic, although, like I said before, without making any difference whatsoever. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have countries like Syria, and the others include Libya, Yemen, and Sudan, where the consequence of the uprising was extremely violent conflict, and Syria being perhaps the most violent of them all. I don't need to go over the details with your listeners, I'm sure they're aware, but basically half the country displaced, millions of refugees. We don't even know how many people are killed, but some people say 500,000. It's extremely violent, and the country's economy is just falling apart, et cetera, et cetera. It's just like really horrific, and the growth of ISIS, or what some people call the Islamic State, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a really terrible situation. And then the conflict evolved over a number of years and was basically frozen for the past 5 years, more or less, with the national territory being divided between different pockets of territory. So you had the part of the territory that was controlled by the former regime, the Ba'ath Party, that controlled basically Damascus and a bunch of cities around it, most of the population, or what was left of the population. Then you had the Northeast, which was in control over the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is broadly a coalition of groups, which is led by a Kurdish armed group as well. And then you had, there are others as well, but I'm simplifying. Then you had one part of the territory, which was Idlib, which was in the north, a small province, not greatly populated, very conservative. That was in control over a group that was called HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, translates more or less as the Commission for the Liberation of Damascus. And HTS is an offshoot from a group of jihadis and Al-Qaeda offshoots, and some people would even say from the Islamic State. And what ended up happening at the end of last year is, as a byproduct of the war between Hezbollah and Israel and Iran and Israel, and also of Russia and Ukraine, all of the Syrian regime's allies that were helping to prop it up over a period of years were distracted and weakened by other conflicts, as a result of which the regime in Damascus really had no one else to rely on. And there was such a state of demoralization. Its troops were so demoralized and so weak and unable to fend for themselves that HTS in Idlib bargained that if they started a lightning offensive after those conflicts in Lebanon and in other places, that they would be able to take major population centers without much resistance. And they started that initiative, or that military campaign, in November. And they made such a huge amount of progress in such a small amount of time that they decided to go all the way, and to go all the way to Damascus. And as a result of that, they took control of the capital within just basically like a couple of weeks. It was pretty remarkable, even though they didn't have that many fighters or that sophisticated weaponry at their disposal. So now today, they're in control over the largest population centers in the country, not the whole national territory, because as I mentioned before, other parts of the territory are controlled by other groups, including the SDF in the northeast and other parts of the territory as well. And the Ba'ath Party now is basically more or less defunct. I mean, it ruled the country for over 50 years, but its leader, Bashar al-Assad, fled to Russia, hopefully never to return. And so what that means now is that these people, HTS, who control the capital, have to, over the coming period, redefine the system of government, write a new constitution, try to establish a new system that's going to keep peace in the country and maintain stability. And that's going to be extremely challenging. I mean, more challenging than any of the other countries that have been through this process over the past 15 to 20 years. The reason why I say that is because no other country in the region has been through this process, the process of negotiating a new constitution, after having lived through such a huge amount of violence and facing such a huge amount of challenges. And just to list them off once again, not all of them, I can't be comprehensive because there are too many challenges, but the challenges that exist include the fact that at the start of the process, the national territory is already divided. So we're going to try to negotiate a constitution where you already have fault lines and armed groups that control different parts of the territory and that don't trust each other at all. The other challenge is the huge amounts of displacement that have taken place, where people don't live in their towns of origin or their cities of origin or their villages of origin. You have millions of people that don't even live in the country anymore. You have a devastating economic situation where there's borderline starvation in many parts of the country. There isn't enough power to keep the lights on in most parts of the country. You have foreign actors that are involved at just about every single level in the country as well, all of which are trying to protect their own interests as opposed to protecting the interests of Syria. And those include, for example, Turkey and Israel, the United States, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, et cetera, so Russia, et cetera, et cetera. There's no limit to the number of foreign actors that are in the country. And I can go on and on and on. Right? And then also, perhaps most importantly, is that the people who are in charge now in Damascus are, I said this before and I repeat, are Islamists who are part of a international jihadi movement, who have instincts that include forcing people to do things that they don't want to do and using extreme levels of violence to control populations. Now, they say that they've changed and that Syria has changed and that Syria's new situation doesn't allow for that system anymore. But nevertheless, I mean, it was just a small number of years in the past where these people were being extremely violent in places like Iraq and Syria. So, I mean, those are questions that are going to have to be resolved. So the challenges in terms of moving forward are going to be extremely difficult. But the process or the situation as we're living through today imposes a certain amount of conditions and hurdles that need to be satisfied or overcome. So those include in the short term, they're going to have to draft and agree on an interim constitution, meaning a temporary constitution to govern the country, because they can't rely on the previous constitution. That was a Ba'athist constitution that was drafted for Bashar al-Assad. So obviously that's out of the question. So they're going to have to draft and adopt a new text. And they're also going to have to adopt a process through which the new constitution, a permanent constitution, is going to be adopted. But in the absence of any form of democratic legitimacy, given that they can't organize an election, given the challenges that I mentioned before. So they're going to have to do it in a way that's sufficiently consensual and democratic and doesn't lead to an uprise or to an uptick in violence, despite the fact that they won't have any democratic legitimacy at all. So, I mean, we can discuss any part of that as you wish, but basically, just to repeat what I've said a few times already, is that this is going to be extremely challenging. And anyone who had any sense and who was a betting man would bet that this is not going to go well. And there's already some indications that it's not going to go well already. But hopefully, you know, who knows? I mean, this could be an exception, but hopefully things will end up in a good place despite all of these challenges.
All right. Well, let's talk about the kind of governance forms that they did in Idlib.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Yeah. So it was a combination of arrangements. So they established what they referred to as a salvation government that was a coalition. And at the same time, HTS had basically like an umbrella over all issues that were ongoing in Idlib. So there were many complaints about human rights abuses under Idlib. And some people have retorted or responded that, yes, there were definitely problems and issues and violations, but broadly those were kept under control by HTS, which was trying to modernize and be more inclusive, right? So apparently there's some truth to that, apparently, but it's not entirely clear to what extent. But also, I mean, the main challenges that we have, and this goes back to what I was saying before, is that HTS broadly will remain in control. It was in control in HTS, in Idlib, and it's going to remain in control in Damascus for now, unless some things change. And HTS, once again, is an Islamist group, when what that means is that they believe that they're religiously inspired. And religiously inspired Islamists do not tolerate dissent. That's a universal rule. I've seen that everywhere. Even if they say that they're willing to be consensual and that they want to build consensus and be democratic and so on and so forth, ultimately, when there's serious disagreements on issues of principle, fundamental principle, they will not concede and they will not accept compromise. And so some of those include, for example, the relationship between religion and state. I mean, for these people, obviously, Islamic Sharia will have to have a primary role in governing countries, in governing Syria. That was true in Idlib, and it's very likely to be true also in Damascus in the future. That's one thing. And the other issue that we're going to have with HTS, particularly in Damascus, but also in Idlib before it, is that they seized control in Idlib before and now in Damascus through force of arms, meaning that they took a huge risk with life and limb. They took a huge risk with their own livelihoods, and many of their colleagues were killed in this violent conflict with the regime and others. And they won, at least for now, right? So when someone descends into a negotiation with them in the past in Idlib and now in Damascus and says, well, I disagree with what it is that you're doing, and I don't accept this presidential system that you're establishing, it needs to be parliamentary, or I don't accept your position on the relationship with religion, between religion and state, whoever's saying that will face two problems. One is what I said before, which is that these people believe that they're religiously inspired and won't accept compromise on issues relating to religion and others. And the other is that they had been fighting for years and years and years, and they won that conflict. So when someone shows up with a suit and tie, a lawyer or whoever, or another political group, and says, no, 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 you've got to be consensual and democratic and accept my perspective, right? They're going to turn around and say, well, who the hell are you? I mean, where were you when we were fighting against the regime and our colleagues were being killed, when I lost my arm or my eye and so on and so forth? You were in your office just trying to survive. And I took these risks, and now I decide, right? You know, I've seen those dynamics over and over again across the region. And in Syria, I think it'll be even more accentuated in other places for the reasons that I've already set out. It's going to be really difficult for them to control those instincts. And incidentally, the violence that we've seen over the past couple of days, over the weekend in the Northwest, is part of that calculation as well. And it's a demonstration that ultimately, if they want to impose themselves through force, they'll do it.
Yeah, that I was going to ask you about that, the whole issue. Again, a lot of people are not familiar with the role of the Alawites in the whole Ba'ath regime. So just explain that to people, and also you just have sort of talked about, because we saw essentially a campaign mounted with visuals showing them executing, I guess, former regime people, or just they could be innocent Alawites in the areas. But what's your sense of what just happened?
Yeah. So basically, the Alawites are an offshoot of Islam. They're their own religious denomination. They have specific beliefs that are unique to them. They've been living on the margins of society in Syria for a long time, for centuries, and through historical circumstances that were pretty unique to Syria at around about the 60s and 70s. The then president who took power in the early 70s, who was Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, was part of that community. Right? He was a member of the Alawite community. He was a military officer and took power through a coup, an internal coup within the Ba'ath Party. And so many people have characterized the regime as having been an Alawite regime. I mean, obviously that's a gross simplification, because it's never that simple. You know, obviously it's really easy to find many Alawites, and probably like a crushing majority of the Alawite community, that had no connection whatsoever to the regime, and in fact had a lot of complaints about the regime. But because of the fact that the president was an Alawite, were associated to it, whether they liked it or not, right? And in fact, the people who really benefited from the regime were not the Alawite community, but rather the people who immediately surrounded the president, including some relatives who were obviously Alawite, and others who happened to be senior colleagues in the Ba'ath Party or the military, who were from other denominations as well. We saw those same dynamics in Iraq as well, by the way, where Saddam Hussein was a Sunni, so therefore everyone associated the Sunni community to Saddam Hussein, even though many Sunnis, and the large majority of them, had no connection to him whatsoever. Anyway, so as a result of that association in Syria, that community has been living in fear since the regime fell, and it was replaced by these guys in Damascus now, by HTS and others. And what ended up happening at around about a week ago or 6 days ago is that some remnants of the former regime apparently carried out coordinated attacks against HTS and some military units that were associated to HTS. So some ambushes here and there in a few parts of the territory, mainly in the Northwest. And in response to that, HTS quickly mobilized and sent huge amounts of units to that territory to try to bring the situation under control. Now, there are different narratives about how things have evolved, after then. So one narrative is that there are units that are not part of HTS, but that are associated to it, or that were based out of Idlib, who are really radical and totally out of control and extremely violent. And they took advantage of this chaotic situation to go into Alawite villages and just kill a lot of people, and basically go into their homes and just kill them, including families, children, etc., right? So that's one narrative. Another narrative is that, well, that's too generous to HTS. In fact, it was units within HTS that were doing that. So it's still not entirely clear. But you have at least those two narratives, and probably others as well. Some people have also said that there are large numbers of Christians who were killed, but it doesn't appear that they were very large in number, that if there were some that were killed, it was just a handful. I mean, obviously, even that's too much, but it doesn't appear that the violence was really directed against that community. It was more directed against the Alawite community. So in response to that, the current interim president of the country, the person from HTS who people were referring to as Jurani before, and whose real name is Ahmed al-Shara, who's now nominated himself or appointed himself as the interim president, has appointed an investigatory commission, and that investigatory commission has been charged with finding out exactly what happened. And he has said in a number of statements that whoever carried out this violence will be punished, regardless of who they are and regardless of whether or not they're part of HTS or not. So that's the sort of thing that you would like him to say, but the proof is going to be in the pudding, and we're going to have to see if they actually end up doing it. It might be something that's easier said than done, and it might be the case that he won't be able to force retribution or to force accountability on people who are too high up in his own ranks. Because ultimately, just like any other political movement, HTS is a coalition of interests and factors and groups, and it may be the case that he won't be able to survive if he goes too forcefully against some of those groups. So that's going to be a challenge, and it's going to have to be a challenge that they're going to have to meet. And ultimately, it not just undermines HTS internally, but also in their efforts to have international economic sanctions removed on Syria. I mean, that's obviously going to be delayed now. There's no question. No one's going to rush into removing those sanctions now, given what happened over the weekend. So it's not irrecoverable. They can still recover, but it's going to take a while.
You talk about up in the Northeast with the Syrian Democratic Front and the Syrian National Army. They've been negotiating ceasefires, but in the background, of course, you have Turkey, and it raises the question of how this was so easily done, why they were able to overthrow the Ba'ath regime so quickly. I mean, obviously, there's internal erosion that we know about, we're well aware of, that had gone on for quite a long time. But then there's examples, and again, I don't know the veracity of some of these reports of the Ukrainians helping them with drone warfare up in Idlib, et cetera. And then the war of the United States. I mean, who overthrew the Ba'ath regime? And also your take on the issue up there in the Northeast, because Trump has just issued a study in February of, essentially ordering the DOD to study how quickly can we withdraw, which is what happened when he fired Esper in the first administration. And then they had this brief flurry where he wanted to pull out, and then the JCS, Miley freaked out, all those guys freaked out. But again, that dimension of it, which again, some people aren't aware of, I certainly have talked to people who served in Syria. And so, just want your understanding of that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm not a military expert, so I won't have anything massively useful to say about whether or not the Ukrainians were involved and whether or not they had any impact. I don't know the answer to that question. But what I do know is that the narrative that's broadly accepted now in Syria and outside of Syria amongst people who are interested in this is that what caused for the regime to fall was two factors: just the fact that its allies were massively preoccupied with other issues, Israel, Ukraine, et cetera, and that the regime itself had become so corrupt and demoralized that they weren't able to put up a fight. So it was less HTS's successful military campaign than it was the weakness of the regime that caused for it to fall apart, which is also, by the way, what we saw in Iraq in 2014 when ISIS invaded and occupied a third of Iraq's national territory. It was less that ISIS or the Islamic State was extremely powerful than it was that the Iraqi state was a bumbling mess at the time, right? It's since recovered, but at the time, that's broadly the narrative that people accept. And then now with the SDF and Turkey and ceasefire, so this is a massive challenge. It remains a massive challenge. So you said the other day that you mentioned that the other day, or just yesterday, I think, they announced an agreement between HTS and the SDF, where they agreed that the SDF's forces would be submerged or subsumed within Syria's national army, which is something that SDF had previously said they would not accept. So now they signed an agreement just a couple of days ago where they now say that they're willing to accept that. But it remains a work in progress because all they've accepted for now is the principle. They haven't accepted any of the detail because there's no detail to accept just yet. It hasn't been worked out at all. And all the agreement says is that the principle is accepted, but that a mechanism has to be established with a view to negotiating the details of how the SDF will be submerged or subsumed within the Syrian National Army before the end of this year. So basically, this is going to be an ongoing process, which, if successful, will take 9 months to organize. If it's not successful, it could either be delayed or it could either fall apart completely as they try to negotiate the details and find that they can't reconcile their positions, which I wouldn't be surprised if it happened because these sorts of efforts have taken place before in the past in other countries and they've all been unsuccessful. So it's really hard to see why they would be successful in Syria. But it's possible. I mean, people have offered explanations as to why they think that those negotiations might be successful in Syria. And they've offered as possible explanations that the SDF won't have any allies to rely on or foreign patrons, and they really feel the noose tightening around their necks. And so they figure they're a better negotiate a position today instead of waiting for things to completely unravel and find that they'll be in a weaker position in the future. So that's an explanation that people have offered, and that might be correct. And then the other problem that they're going to have between HTS and the SDF is negotiating a system of government, because the SDF has insisted that they want to maintain local autonomy in the territory that they control. And on the other hand, HTS has insisted that they won't accept any form of local autonomy and that the country must be organized centrally from Damascus. So ultimately, I think that both sides will probably accept some form of compromise, but they're going to have to work out a lot of the detail, and it's not clear at all what that might look like. And that's going to be a very long and difficult conversation that's going to require a lot of patience and expertise. And it's too early to say how that's going to end up for now. But like I said before, all the other countries where these sorts of conversations have happened have not been successful. None have reached a successful conclusion. And it will be a real surprise if Syria ends up being the exception to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to bring Alex in a second. One thing that does also, before I do that, strike me is Iran's role, because we know Trump has reached out to Iran, put a peace feeler out to them. And Iran, of course, had a very sizable involvement in Syria going back to the Iran-Iraq War early on, when they deliberately aligned themselves with the Assad regime against Saddam. And also Israel. Israel basically taking over the Golan, some arguing that they're poised to directly threaten Damascus with military operations. And again, these are geopolitical questions, but again, you get into this bouillabaisse of how you can have a constitutional process resolve itself with the kind of issues you talk about earlier in your exegesis on Arab constitutionalism. So, just throw that in the mix too, because again, it's a complicated picture. And Russia, of course, Russia's out there. Who knows? They want to basically retain their bases at Latakia and Tartus. So, there's all this. It's a fascinating situation. And again, how does it actually work out into a constitutional process which establishes legitimacy and peace for the people in Syria? Because I'm sure they want peace.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'm sure all Syrians would like stability and peace, but hopefully they'll get it. So, I mean, on those two countries, Iran and Israel, and you mentioned the U.S. before. So Iran currently doesn't really have much of a foothold in Syria anymore. Their main ally was the Ba'athist regime, as you mentioned before, and that regime is basically fallen apart. And the current regime in Damascus, HTS, has been overtly hostile towards Iran. I mean, it's one of the few countries that they've singled out as being as a target of their hostility. So there doesn't seem to be much scope for them to be involved currently. But I mean, of course, that can change, and I'm sure Iran's keeping a close eye on developments in Syria and would likely exploit any opportunity that they can find to regain a foothold and be influential in that country. I mean, they won't want to abandon it completely, given what they appear to have lost so far. And to the extent that they can, I'm sure that they would want to undermine HTS. For Israel, so it's less clear, and to be honest, I haven't made up my mind as to what I think that they're doing. There's an interesting piece that was published either today or yesterday by Michael Young, who's an analyst who focuses on Lebanon, who expressed the view that Israel's trying to break Syria apart, or at least make it into a completely failed state with no capacity to rebuild itself. This as a means to prevent any future threat emerging in Syria. That may be right. It's not entirely clear to me. I'm certainly not convinced that Israel is getting involved in order to protect minorities in Syria. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. But I'm sure it's a convenient thing to say. But it might also be the case that they're interested in water resources in the territories that they share a border with. But apart from that, I don't really know. It's hard to say. But what those things do bring out together is more challenges for HTS and for the country as a whole as they embark on this really challenging transition that they're on. And while it's true that you can focus on more than one thing at a time, and that if you're right in negotiating a constitution, it doesn't mean that you can't address other challenges at the same time. But the sheer number of challenges that these people have to face over the coming period is really overwhelming, and they really are overwhelmed. And it's difficult to believe that they can deal with all of these problems successfully, or even half of them, to be generous. So, these other two factors that you've mentioned, Iran and Israel, are just two more complications that they have to face, and it's going to continue being challenging in the future.
Yeah, and of course, the Israelis were systematically attacking with the Air Force the conventional assets of the Syrian army. Go on, Alex.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just wonder, comparatively, how would you compare Arab constitution with like a Asian, African, and Latin American history of constitutionalism? I feel like I want again, this idea of like Asian constitutions, that there's a close connection with economic development, and again, of course, case of Asian constitutions, they, many of them went through periods of right-wing military dictatorship, but at a certain point there goes, because again of the economic development, the rise of middle class, countries like South Korea or say Taiwan, that there's eventually a transition between that military government and then explicit parliamentary or presidential systems. And of course again we have the example of South Korea of very successful reaction and pro-democratic to what President Yoon did. So yes, I just wonder how you would do you ascribe to that, again, to that developmental constitutional model, and again, what just you think in terms of comparisons to Arab and other post-colonial constitutions around the world?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So the closest parallels that we have are to Latin America, which you mentioned as well, but not to today's Latin American constitutions, but rather to the systems of government as they existed in the 70s and 80s, so under the military dictatorships broadly. So that's broadly where we are today in the Middle East and North Africa. In Latin America, they've moved on. I'm speaking very generally, but many countries in Latin America have moved on, and they're experimenting with all sorts of innovations and different types of arrangements, whereas we in the region have really stayed in this mummified state, which has existed since the colonial period, and which continues until today, with very little scope for any form of innovation. We went from being governed by Ottomans and British and French people to then being governed by non-democratic locals who started using extreme levels of violence and oppression to keep control over their populations. And that's still where we are today. And they don't have any answers to the challenges of the modern societies that we're trying to strive for. So instead of modernizing and innovating solutions to some of these problems that we have, what many of these countries are trying to do is to encourage people to leave. So that way the state doesn't need to spend any money on them anymore. It doesn't have to educate them, doesn't have to treat them in hospital. And then when they leave, then they earn salaries and wherever it is, like in Canada or the US or in Europe. And then they send that money home to their elderly parents or their siblings, et cetera, right? So the drain is gone, and then they get this income from these people who live abroad, right? And then also the people who leave tend to be the most entrepreneurial and the most likely to complain. So then you get rid of these large segments of the population who are more likely to revolt against you. And that's basically their big innovation, is just to get rid of people. It's a real drama and tragedy. And if we were to redesign things in a way that made more sense, then the nature of the state would have to change completely. And so economic development is obviously something that we absolutely definitely need, given that demographics are out of control and there aren't enough jobs for people. And we still rely very much on oil and gas in many of these countries to be the only source of revenue for the state, right? So it's definitely economic reform is necessary. But in terms of the place of the state and its relationship with the individual, for the longest period of time, the reason for the state's existence in the Middle East and North Africa is to protect elites, right? So previously it was to allow for foreign elites to extract resources. Then it became to allow for local elites to continue to extract resources and to be there for its own sake, right? The state was there for itself. And if you threatened the state, then you were a traitor. Even if your reasons for threatening the state, just a mere complaint would mean that you were a traitor, okay? And that went through all state institutions. So if you were a judge, then your responsibility wasn't to determine justice. Or if you were faced with a criminal defendant, it wasn't to determine whether or not this person was guilty. It was rather to determine what they're guilty of and to find a way to send them to jail for the longest period of time. So the relationship between the individual and the state has to change, and it has to change in a way so that individuals in these countries as people can thrive in their own nations without having to leave, right? So they don't need to look at Canada or the US as being the best way for them to thrive or the most likely way in which they can reach their full potential. The state has to be redesigned so as to have as its objective to create the conditions so that they can achieve those same objectives in their own countries, right? And for now, we're really far away from that. There isn't a single country where that's the case.
Yeah, and I wonder what you think. You think Iran's constitution has been any kind of model? Because again, it's kind of special. Again, revolutionary government. Obviously, there's a role of the supreme leader there, but they have democratic elections, and there is a establishment, but they're kind of a dual track, I guess you could say, government. So I wonder if what do you think of them as a model, and how they're different from the other constitutions?
Iran is, first of all, I'm not really an expert on the Iranian constitution, but it can never be a real model for the Middle East and North Africa, simply because it's a different culture, it's a different country. We don't speak Farsi in our countries, and it's they have their own thing going on. So no one's really trying to replicate the Iranian constitutional model in the region. And on top of that, it doesn't really seem to function very well. Internally it appears to be more or less stable, but that's more a function of the fact that there aren't any real threats to the regime internally, and a function of the tools of repression, as opposed to stability through legitimacy, right? So it doesn't appear that the Iranian regime is stable because they've managed to achieve democratic legitimacy or legitimacy through strong performance, right? They're undergoing serious problems internally, socially, economically, even politically, but it remains stable because there aren't any other organized political forces that can really challenge it within the country. And there's no one who's been able to overcome that problem. But people outside the country can look at Iran and see that it doesn't really function properly, and so they don't find that it's a system that's worthy of being emulated. There are groups that do attach themselves to Iran and try to learn from some aspects of a system, but that's more in terms of its revolutionary model and like revolutionary groups and armed groups and how they can form sort of like a parallel state on the margins or on the outside of a formal state structure. So what they're trying to replicate or to learn from the Iranian model isn't to ways to improve the state's performance, but rather how to undermine the state by creating parallel systems that function outside of the state, right? Which is something that some groups have done in Iraq and in Lebanon.
Joan, can you unmute?
Joan, do you have any comments you want to add or questions, Joan?
Yeah, I just had a comment. Thank you for all the information. But it just seems like people all over the world just want like the basics, like food, clothing, shelter, just to be able to live. Like, they're not looking for diamonds, they're not looking for gold enough. But with all this suppression, like when the government suppresses you so much, how does it, like, the countries function? I know, like you said, they go and they just kill people or get rid of them. I mean, if you say something, but if you wind up like killing everybody, and then, or they want them to go and go and live in other countries and send the money back and all. But how does the country function like that? Maybe we're gonna find out. But the thing is, don't people eventually rise up and say, we're not going to take this anymore? I mean, it's hard to believe that in this day and age that people just can't live like a life where you're not looking for anything but just to live.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks very much for that. So the answer to the question, how do countries function, is not very well, right? So yeah, they don't function in the way that you would like them to function, and there's everyday challenges and things that people are very familiar with, including incompetence and corruption, mismanagement, and perverse incentives that make it extremely difficult to live in some of these places. So some of them are worse than others, and some of them are more manageable than others, but none of them reach the level of standard of living that you would aspire to as a person. Mainly because there are everyday problems that should be easy to fix, but that never seem to get fixed, and that sometimes just keep getting worse. And I can give you lots of examples, but I'm sure the listeners will know what I'm talking about. And then the second aspect of your question, which is, it's hard to believe that people would take this type of thing, and don't they rise up? So the answer is yes, they do rise up, but they can't do it over a sustained period of time and repeatedly. So the last time there was an uprising was in 2011, where you had a region-wide uprising where we don't know exact numbers, but definitely in their millions, people were rising up across the region. And even people who weren't rising up were supportive. Not all of them, but the very large majority of people. But that can't be sustained for forever. And there has to be a point in time where people either lose faith or feel that they've achieved enough, or where they just have to get on with their daily lives. But then when they revert back to the same state that they were in before, that caused for them to rise up in the first place, then you know for certain that it's going to happen again. But you need that trigger, right? You need something to trigger that movement. And it's not clear what it is that needs to happen in order for the trigger to take place. It's really difficult to know, because even in the last occasion when it happened, meaning what people refer to as the Arab Spring, the suicide, the self-immolation that caused the uprising to take place wasn't the first self-immolation, nor was it the last one, right? And we don't know why that specific self-immolation caused for the uprising to take the life that it did. No one will probably never know. But be that as it may, there are certain things that happen and societies reach a state where they're ready to rise up, and then a spark takes place, and then it takes a life of its own. And that's how society functions. I just hope that the next time that this happens, there'll be greater clarity of what the ultimate end goal is, and organized political movements that are able to move society in that direction, that aren't too self-interested, and that can act in a way that's sufficiently representative of people's interests.
I gather you're going to Libya this week. Are you going to be doing that for the purposes of looking at the constitutional debate in Libya?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's why I go to these countries. Yeah.
Ah. Well, it'd be really interesting after you come back to hear you talk about what happened. But I wanted to thank you so much for spending time today. It was really, really terrific, man. It was very insightful, really valuable, and bon voyage. Have a good trip.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for taking the time. It was great speaking to you.
No, it was our pleasure to hear you talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.